was May of 1999 when Martha Wolford, a high school student, received an assignment in her American history class to do an oral history project of some historical event that happened. She decided to interview some World War II vets and talk with them about their experiences in the war in Europe, and also information regarding concentration camps that were run by the Nazis. The group gathered around the kitchen table and they told their stories. They recalled many things with amazing details, events that took place over 50 years ago. The stories they told were factual, sometimes horrible, sometimes humorous. Martha's mother, Lori, was intrigued by the recorded information, and she decided to transcribe it and print a book, using all the information they heard and that they picked up from the tape. Lori also did some further research on the war, and she was able to add a lot of background material to the book. The following video is a reenactment of this conversation that took place some years ago. The words of the four veterans will be read by four gentlemen from New Ulm.
I think I'd like to preface this discussion from my perspective. I enlisted, and when I went in, it was a job. It was 1942, and each one of us had a different segment of that job, a different kind of activity, but it was a job which we did despite the adversity, and some of that adversity was very, very ugly, but I treated it as something I had to do until it was over. That's my preface.
Very good. I can match you. I also enlisted, and my serial number started with 1. So when we came to the outfit, the old staff people would look at me and say, regular Army guy. You know, you don't think of that in those terms. It was simply that when you enlisted, they assigned you a regular Army serial number rather than a number 3 that the draftees got. But I guess I agree with Bob and looked upon it as something that had to be done. And I've always said, I wouldn't take $1 million for the experience, but I wouldn't take $1 million to do it again.
I wouldn't take $2 million.
Why don't we identify the units we were in so everybody will know what area of Europe we were in? Stan, you first.
Thanks. I was in the 3rd Army, 21st Armored Infantry Battalion, and ended up in the 11th Armored Division. And the 21st was affiliated with the tanks. They moved together with the tankers. I was not an enlistee, but I was one of those damn draftees. Despite regular Army guys saying, those damn draftees, I figured I had no business being there. I was married, had a child on the way, and was farming at the time. I just got the corn planted when Uncle Sam said, I want you. So I guess that was it. Then after you get acclimated to it, if you ever do, it's like you say it was a job that had to be done, and you couldn't hold it against the guys that were training you because they had a job to do too. I could see where their hands were full with some of these guys. I was probably one of them. I was drafted on my birthday in 1942.
Is that right? You beat me in October.
Now you're telling me how old you are. I was drafted and went in August of 1942.
Geez, and I'm the short timer here. I went in November of 1942, but I was 19 then. At that time, they weren't drafting them until 20.
Yeah, I could see where a 19-year-old guy would enlist right after Pearl Harbor.
Well, that was quite a while after Pearl Harbor.
When I went in, we went to Texas for light artillery, then to Shelby in Mississippi, and then on to Fort Bragg. At Fort Bragg, we went to the 155s, and then we switched over to 240 millimeter howitzers. Anyway, we were GHQ in Europe and went wherever they needed artillery, so we covered the front pretty well.
Were you 3rd Army the whole time?
No, we were British 2nd and 9th Army as well as 3rd Army. We covered the front pretty well.
You know, I think my lucky stars I wasn't in on D-Day for the invasion.
Well, we were supposed to be, but they needed more artillery. We were held at Fort Bragg 6 weeks longer than planned because they needed more infantry for the invasion. So they loaded them up first. Then we went over on a British ship and we had boiled liver and onions, and then boiled onions and liver. Such a variety. But we were fortunate and we were in the hold of the ship. We had charge of the mess hall and they had to bring all the food out of the hold to the kitchen. So we fared fairly decent that way. Then we landed in England and got all new equipment. We crossed the channel in a storm and landed at high tide and dropped off into 4 feet of water. That crossing was rough and we lost a convoy while doing it. We didn't think we were going to make it, but we did. The first position we went into was close to a submarine base in Brest, France, The Germans had all their guns pointed out to the ocean, and they couldn't get at us. They fired point blank.
Were they shooting direct fire?
Well, we fired directly into the wall. We were ready to fire again, but then they got notice from the Red Cross. They needed more supplies, so we stopped. We watched the Red Cross move in, and that stopped everything. They got their stuff and moved out, and then it all started up again. We got one shot into the wall and near the mess hall. An hour later, our commander let us go up and look at the results, and boy, we saw it. Terrible. Later, we ended up at the Elbe River outside of Berlin when the war was over. We could have been in Berlin sooner, but that was the line that Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt said was as far as we could go. So all we did for the next 2 weeks was guard German prisoners who were coming through and didn't want to get caught by the Russians. Well, that's about it for me.
I enlisted in 42 and took basic training, and these guys will giggle at this, but I took a test, and the Army had a program called, Stu will remember this, the Army Special Training Program.
Hey, I was in it.
And then the casualties accelerated to a level that they had to get more troops, so they canceled the program, and I was assigned to the 89th Division, which at that time was a light infantry division scheduled to go to Burma. We were armed with 75-pack howitzers pulled by a jeep, but the Burmese campaign ended, and we were converted to a triangular division, that's 3 regiments of infantry, and I was fortunate enough to get assigned to the division artillery headquarters battery, which is the unit that controls all those battalions. During the campaign through Luxembourg and Germany, we did an amphibious landing. We crossed the Rhine with the Navy coming up and taking us across on LCIs, so we didn't have a D-Day, but we did have the same kind of experience, crossing the Rhine under fire. And the Rhine is about a mile across. And during that time, we discovered, not discovered, but we came to a concentration camp, and we were the first American unit to liberate a concentration camp. Eisenhower ordered all his commanders to come up and look at the inhumanity exhibited by humans. I can remember that we were in a town more than just a mile away, and you could smell the stench. The people in the town had conditioned themselves to the point that they ignored or even just denied the existence of this place.
Had you heard any rumors about concentration camps before that?
I can't recall hearing any rumors. Now I'm sure that we did, though. We had heard about the atrocities the Germans had done to some of our troops at Malines, or what was that place?
That was Malmedy in the Hürtgen Forest.
They killed all the wounded and prisoners, about 300 American soldiers.
I was the last of this group to go into the service. I was just 19 at the time in 1942. I enlisted and got sent to Fort Snelling and then to Camp Adar in Oregon. I did my basic with the 96th Division. After a training period for weeks out there, I was called into the company commander's office, and he asked me if I was interested in training to be a supply sergeant, and I said, yes, sir. And from that day on, I was trained to be a supply sergeant. And in March of 43, we went down to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, to open up the 69th Division, and the old supply sergeant had the option of staying there or going with us, but he stayed because he had a girlfriend there. And that was my good fortune because I got out of there. That outfit ultimately ended up in the Pacific, and I would have hated that very much. We went to Shelby, and all of a sudden, one day, I get greetings to go to Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, and get tested for ATCP. Being a first sergeant, I took a group of 30 men to Ole Miss in the northern part of the state, and we were there for 2 weeks for testing. After the tests, an old professor sat with me and said I passed with flying colors, but did not have the subjects from high school to study engineering, which is where I was headed. I told him, you got to remember that in 1940, only 10% of high school students went to college. The rest of us worked, so we didn't have to take college courses. I told him I wanted to go to college, if for no other reason than to get out of that division. Then I took a contingent to Oklahoma, where we went to school in Stillwater for 6 months. Like Bob, next spring we had to go to the 103rd Division camp in Housie, Texas. Ultimately, we loaded up at Camp Shanks, New York, and from there we went out to Marseille in the Mediterranean. We were part of the 7th Army, which was the southernmost army on the continent.
Were you infantry?
You bet I was. This was the 103rd Division, 411th Infantry. I was in the anti-tank company, so we were special units, and we're there for a reason. We drove while the other guys walked. Our line of battle took us up through the Siegfried Line, out onto the Rhine Plain. That's where we crossed the Rhine River. We sat there for a week doing military government duty in Ludwigshafen until they had a Bailey Bridge built. We could watch dogfights between the American planes and the Germans. It was quite a show. The Germans would try to bomb the engineers' work, and then the American planes would come in. We left there and went to Heidelberg, Stuttgart, and Ulm, and down into Innsbruck, Austria, where we were assigned to a combat team to take the Brenner Pass. When we left Innsbruck and went south to meet the 5th Army near the international boundary, then my regiment went on a side road to Landsberg, and that's where the concentration camp was that we were supposed to open up. Al Polta was with us then. He'd been in a line company officer and had been injured 3 times, so they put him in a service company, so I got to see him daily. When we got to Landsberg, we went out to the concentration camp, and I did not personally see this, but he started raising hell in German with the civilians. And the few soldiers that were left there, he would get to stack these corpses, and that was a fright. He was just wild, but he got the job done. The people in town denied that there was anything out there. They said, "You don't know what you're talking about." So he said to them, "Why is your basement full of high-priced clothing, furniture, and other stuff you stashed away? You were expecting the American planes to come and bomb your city, weren't you?" They said, "No, we just put it there for safekeeping." It was just denial. They did not want to admit that there was a concentration camp out there. In 1985, my wife and I traveled to Europe and went to Munich, and then we went to Dachau. I saw Dachau when it was emptied out and got to see the history of it. They had a very large wall map that showed where all the camps were in Germany. It was unreal. There were dozens and dozens of them. Dachau and Landsberg were major ones, and then there were the minor ones where they would bring political prisoners in and keep them there for a while until they had room to put them in the major ones.
I talked with a gentleman this morning about some things regarding the military, and he said that Ohrdruf, once a concentration camp, is now a German military camp. Isn't that ironic?
Yes, that is ironic. You asked before whether we knew anything about these camps. The first inkling that we got was several days before we drove along a road. We started meeting these guys in army clothes walking along in the ditches. We stopped to talk with them, and they said they were from camps, but we still didn't catch on as to what it was all about. Of course, the American military government didn't want them to walk away because they were carrying all kinds of diseases, unfortunately. There were other prisoners that were slave laborers. As I went across Bavaria, there were lots of little towns with slave laborers from Poland, Russia, Hungary, and Romania.
How did these people react when you liberated them?
Well, if they were in good health, they were as happy as can be.
Oh, they were glad to see you.
Yeah, if they were in poor health, very often they expired from the excitement.
Stan had quite an experience with a concentration camp.
Well, we bypassed basic training. When I was through with basic training at Camp Wallace, Texas, we came up to Fort Sheridan in Illinois. There we were supposed to fill out a 40 buffer unit.
Sure, anti-aircraft.
Yep, that was to go to Africa. On the way we caught a bug and we all got diarrhea. They thought we had cholera. We were isolated and all we got was bread and water. Anyhow, they got some other guys to take the Africa project, so that was a break for us. We heard afterwards that they got the hell kicked out of them. And from there, I went east to New York City, where they had a Wright's airplane factory, and it was our mission to protect it. It was another camp, and we were scattered all over. I was a switchboard operator, like a plane spotter. Yeah, they had this radar deal, and it was pretty new. It was not accurate to see anything. It spotted everything that flew in the area, and all you saw was a little spot on the screen, and that was supposed to be a plane. Well, you got to know where the plane came from and where it was headed. After a while, they decided the chances of Germany bombing the factory was getting remote. So they decided they didn't need us, so they shipped us down to Camp Gordon, Georgia. They had a washed-out paratrooper, lieutenant there, who had a broken ankle or something. So he was as ornery as could be. I mean, man, did he work us. He was mad because he had washed out. He was half crazy, I think. He talked around, and all of a sudden, he would grab his knife and throw it into a tree. After this refresher course, I lost 10 pounds. I had a cushy job there as a switchboard operator, no KP, no guard duty. Then we boarded the Queen Mary. We got way down in the hold, way up front. You know how long the Queen Mary is, up and down, up and down. I had lost another 10 pounds by the time we got over there. It only took 5 days, and the Queen Mary went unescorted with no zigzagging. They changed course about every 10 minutes so no submarine could ever get a target.
Oh, I'd been told that they went straight.
No, of course, you couldn't prove it by me. I was blue and green under the gills from seasickness.
You were feeding the fish, huh?
Yeah, who wouldn't, you know? Well, way up in the front of the ship, they had 4 hammocks high, and the top guy would get sick down on the bottom guy. Anyhow, from there we landed in Glasgow, I guess where we docked the ship.
Glasgow is inland, but anyway, you landed in Scotland.
Yep. Then we took a train to London. And the guys scattered all over the pubs. I thought they'd never find them. Then we got one of these little boats and crossed the English Channel. Some guys got seasick all over again, and that was at Le Havre.
You landed at Le Havre? Well, so did we.
There we got 40 and 8s. Definition for 40 and 8s was 40 men and 8 horses. That's where we ended up as replacements, where they needed them. I ended up in this armored infantry. They didn't walk. They rode in half tracks, and we were all teamed up with the tankers. Tanks would move up to a town, and they'd shell the dickens out of them. And then the armored infantry would move in with a small platoon. I got my taste of the Maginot Line, and then the Siegfried Line. And then we hold it up in a Siegfried bunker. And as we got prisoners, we would have to take them back. I didn't appreciate that either, and somehow or other, it got out that I could talk German. That was not the best, of course, as I got the dirty end of the stick. Whenever we would attack a town and they didn't want to sleep out in the snow, we'd take over a section of the town, and we'd translate, tell them all to move out. Take 2 guys with you, big intimidating guys like Bob Runk here. And I would give them just 10 minutes to move out. And the women would cry, and the little baby kids would cry that Herr Schneider is here. I don't know. The best thing was not to let them know that you spoke German, otherwise they'd grab you. I would just say, Raus, 10 Minuten.
When did you get to Le Havre?
That would have been in January.
That would have been in 1945. Stu, you came about the same time?
No, I came in August 1944. You were there much earlier, June or July?
July.
Once you got there, it didn't take you long from the time you got off the boat. It took only 2 weeks, and you were in a foxhole. We didn't get any equipment. When we got to this outfit we were going to replace, we could hear them shooting, and we didn't have a damn rifle yet.
You know, there were a lot of historians that have recorded that. I just finished one of Ambrose's books.
Citizen soldiers?
Well, I read that one, and I just read The Victors. I can relate to what you said about admitting that you spoke any German, because I did that, and then the first thing you know, you're an interpreter. And I didn't know German that well, but I did a lot of the same thing you did. I looked for quarters when we got into a town, and I can tell you a lot of hairy stories about that.
Yep.
Which camp is this, Stan, on your photo here?
Mauthausen.
Yeah, that was a big one, too.
Yeah, some of those guys were so weak they could hardly get up to the fence. The prisoners were all skin and bones. Inside the camp, the bunks were stacked too high, and in the bottom bunk, one guy laid this way and the other laid the other way, 4 guys in 2 bunks. And as they died there, the living would take the bandages off the dead and put them on them and pile them up outside. We happened to stop in a little town, and there was a bombed-out drugstore. And we went in there. And one guy found a little box camera. Well, my son had these pictures blown up in the cities because they were real small and starting to deteriorate.
Were you allowed to have cameras?
No.
Well, we neither.
Well, another guy was smart enough to have these pictures developed, and that's how they came about. And like you'd say, the people would deny this. I talked to some of them, and at first they thought Hitler was a nice guy, a savior, you know. He got everybody jobs, and he built roads.
Organized the economy.
Yeah, until it was too late.
Hey, you guys know Gerhard Christ here in town? We went down to the cities in his van, and he was telling us that when he was 8 years old during the war, he was 100% for Hitler. He didn't know any better. He got a job where he earned a picture instead of pay. He earned a picture of Hitler and took it home. He was so proud of that picture. His folks put it up, but they never said a word. He didn't know why until the war was over that they hated him. But they didn't talk within the family because they were afraid.
When we came, we started cleaning up these dead bodies from the concentration camp. Bulldozers dug a trench, and they hauled out bodies in two-wheeled carts. Once in a while, one would fall off, and they'd just pick them up and throw them back on.
Sprinkle lime on top of them?
Yep,
And this is how you found them?
yep.
That winter, they found bodies stacked like cordwood.
I was at two of them, Landsberg and Dachau. We got to Dachau after they had cleaned it out.
We got there about an hour or two after the Germans left, and there were bodies where they had dug out under the foundation that they didn't get in. They just shot them and pulled them out. Oh, God, what a smell.
They had these towers around the camp.
Guard towers.
And those German soldier kids, one 12-year-old sat up in a tower and took pot shots at the prisoners down there.
They were told that they weren't humans.
Well, we went back there for a 50-year anniversary. I happened to run across two guys who had been inmates there, and they told us stories that would make your hair stand up. At Mauthausen, they had this big stone quarry, and the prisoners would have to carry a rack on their back, and that was loaded up with stones, and they'd have to carry that all the way up those steps to the top. Terry and I tried to count. 800 feet. They must have been real high because they looked pretty small down there.
When you reached the camp, had the Germans left?
They realized that the jig was up, and most of them had just left the day before. There were still a few there, and they kept the gates closed. When we got there, the prisoners would try to get out, but we couldn't allow that as they'd die. They'd been in solitude, and they were just skin and bones. They could hardly walk. They'd just take off, and we'd round them up and take them back to camp. They were dying like flies when we got there. As inhumane as all that was, you couldn't think that could happen. You'd think they would never allow anyone to get that much power again.
I think we should mention something about how we were always on the move. None of us stayed in one place more than a day or two. You could sleep inside sometimes and outside other times. Fortunately, I was in division headquarters, so I slept inside.
Well, we took over in towns. The Germans never figured we could. We'd set up the howitzer. It was so damn big. We'd set it up in the middle of town. And every time we'd shoo them out of the towers. They figured we couldn't get in there, but we did. We just took over whatever quarters we needed.
The people I rousted out were mostly in the basements. That was the only part of the house in one piece. We'd stay in one room that wasn't damaged. I remember one time there was only one little room left. We'd all lay down together and move from one side to the other at the same time. It's so damn cold. We built a wood fire, and then just when we were getting warmed up, we get orders to move out.
Remember how neat the forests were? Nothing left.
I remember walking 10 miles with a bundle of twigs.
And the food we ate. At first, we had C rations, 3 kinds.
I had K's first.
Oh, we had C's for the longest time.
C's were in cans.
Pork and beans and stew. What was the third one?
Ham and eggs.
Ham and eggs, right. And then we got C rations. There was a whole variety. But then we got K's. K's are like a Cracker Jack box.
Well, it's in a can with a heavy wax on it. It was a can of beef and cheese.
Chicken.
They always told us we wouldn't be on K rations for more than 3 days. But shoot, when we left Marseille and started up the river valley, we were on them for a week.
Sometimes they throw them all in one pot and just stir it up.
They had a little tin can about the size of a tuna can. Some of them had ham and eggs, some of them had Spam.
And cheese.
One of them was cheese, that's right.
Solid cheese.
Yeah, it was good cheese, actually.
Oh, it bound me up.
You'd get 4 crackers and 4 cigarettes and a couple pieces of hard candy.
And something else really important.
Toilet paper.
A roll of toilet paper.
Did any of you guys get into these DP camps, displaced persons?
You bet.
Yeah.
That was something to see too, wasn't it? All of these people from here and there and all over put into these camps.
That's what I was explaining earlier about Bavaria. There were so many factories down there where they had these people working, and then after the army went through, they were on their own, and they started wandering around. Then they started to organize them into DP camps.
Why, that was one place you wanted to stay away from because they had every disease known to man and a few extras. Boy, it was pathetic.
They would drink anything, even kerosene in a bottle.
You know, after the war, we got near to the Rhine River before there were civilians around. And after that, there were civilians around all the time. They'd bring us wine and bread and everything else, but we didn't know if it was loaded or not. We'd grab them by the collar and make them take the first drink.
Guys, didn't you get a kick out of the names in these little towns? Everything ended in a rye. Baccarai, Flasherai, Brauerei. We stopped one time and the guys quick went out and got a pony of beer and tied it onto the front of a half-track. Just had time to tie it on halfway, and it was time to move out. So by the time we got to the evening stop, we decided we were going to halt, and there was a little bit of a bounce to it. The guy stopped short, the rope broke, and the pony of beer fell off the truck and rolled all the way out of reach. We all laughed. We lived a little bit off the Germans. Every time we stopped, we'd raid the pantry. They always hid the hams up in the attic. We ate more damn ham and eggs. The mess trucks would catch up in about 2 weeks, then we got a rest. Then after 2 weeks, we'd get a break and we'd go back, and another outfit would move ahead in a little bit. During that time, we could get cleaned up a little bit, and then you got the hot food. Everybody would get the diarrhea like crazy from the mess of all the pancakes and stuff.
Well, talking about that, we were in the pocket with Patton that one time when they surrounded us, and all we got was summer sausage, and we got that for almost 2 weeks.
We had a period when we had 2 meals a day.
Well, was that unusual?
Yeah, you'd get 3.
On the Queen Mary, on the way over, they only fed us twice a day. There were so many people.
Well, the same with us, only 2 meals a day.
I went home on the Aquitania, and it's 32 feet shorter than the Queen Mary. We had 10,000 troops on there. I was on the other end of the ship, on the tail end, on the stern, below the waterline, and we got 2 meals a day. And immediately you'd go from the mess hall over to the canteen and get in the line so you could buy a few candy bars or something to tide you over.
I always got lost in those damn ships. They had so many one-way stairways, 5 or 6 decks. The first couple of times a guy might take you to the mess hall, but after the second day you were left on your own, and you'd see guys wandering all over.
Yeah, this was after the war. Stan, I got to tell you this story about when I went over. We went over in September of 45.
You mean 44?
Yeah, 44. We hit a storm in the middle of the Atlantic. We were headed for Gibraltar. It was miserable. 3,000 men on board, and one morning only 12 of us went down for breakfast. We had to go above deck, then they announced we had to go above deck, and then they announced an alternative route below deck, and then we got about 80 more, but that was it. 100 guys out of 3,000 that could eat.
All you guys did, you ate standing up to the tables. They were about that wide, and the food from one end would go whoosh and slide right back as the ship rolled.
And about every other one, he'd grab that kip that'd go by and then blah.
On the way home, we came on one of those little Victory ships, and there was a field artillery unit, and they had the bottom deck, and there was only 13 armored infantry guys on there. And we got to sleep with the crews in the middle deck.
We came back on a Victory ship too.
We went over and slept in staterooms.
I sold my extra pistols and stuff to a guy that was along, and these field artillery guys, they didn't get any of that stuff.
Where'd you confiscate those at?
No, he sold them. He sold them to the field artillery guys.
Oh boy, they shook us down to a fare thee well when we came back.
I had a whole bag full of stuff.
I had a whole set of sterling silver, 12 of them, that I carried and I wanted to send home, but I never did. Boom, here comes the order, you can't send anything more home. So I used it as a piece at a time and then threw it in the garbage until there was nothing left of it. If that war would have lasted one more day in Japan, we'd have been out to the Pacific.
Do you guys remember where you were the day you heard the war was over?
We were down south of Munich.
Do you mean VE Day?
May 8th, I do. Zwickau, Germany.
I was in the Brenner Pass.
We were up in the Elbe River outside of Berlin.
We were in the Austrian Alps, and that was the so-called Redu area, where they figured the SS would put out a last-ditch stand. That evening we were looking and we can see smoke way up on the mountaintop. There were German soldiers up there, and we took our anti-tank guns and put them on the hillside because they're flat to elevation, and they put high explosive bombs on, and they fired up there, and the next day we had a bunch of wounded walk down. That was the last day of the war.
Were they SS?
Oh, sure. Then a few days later, a couple of women came, and they had a little boy with them who had a broken arm. They were walking, of course. They had no vehicles. We offered to take him in the Jeep down to our aid station to get the bone set, which we did. When we came back there, our Jeep driver was bound and determined to take these people back to where they came from. They kept telling us, Amberg, Amberg. They lived up on the mountain. You couldn't get up there with this Jeep. He said, there isn't anywhere I can't get. So, sure enough, we got up there. And there's a guest house up there, a hotel where skiers would go in the wintertime. A lot of people around, a lot of women, a lot of children. And now it's about supper time, so they wanted to feed us, so they did. We had scrambled eggs and goat's milk, warm out of the goat. I just about gagged. All of a sudden, we kept seeing these young guys in civilian clothes walking through there, and I said to my driver, we better get the hell out of here. I told our company commander about it, and the next morning he took a squad up there and flushed them out. There was a whole bunch of SS men up there just sweating it out.
They don't want people over there to forget what happened. At Mauthausen, they have now preserved a couple of barracks and crematoriums. They have buses come in from different towns on tours to show them what was going on.
Same thing at Dachau. That's where my wife Colette and I were in '85. The whole camp is still there except that buildings have been destroyed. They've put up some new buildings, one for the museum and a couple of them to show what the old barracks looked like. And at the far end of it, there are 3 religious buildings. One is a Catholic church, one is a Protestant church, and one is a Jewish synagogue. And the people who operate them live just outside the walls.
If any of you get to Washington, which I'm sure all of you have been, the Holocaust Museum is awesome.
I had all I wanted to see in Dachau.
Well, you've seen it, you know.
How long were you in Europe before, after the war ended?
2 months, I think.
I left in September.
And I came home in October.
I was home by VJ Day, so I was home by August.
Now, we had to wait 3 weeks for a boat to get home. Then I got a 30-day recuperation period. I was supposed to go to Japan. You got discharged by the number of points you had in your back pocket.
What did they do to that Mauthausen prison guard?
That guy, I don't know what they did.
Do you think they tried him in trial and sentenced him?
You know, he was just doing his job. Prisoners would come in and take a shower. When we got there, there were still some guys waiting there, and instead of water coming out of the shower head, they would spray poisonous gas.
Isn't it interesting, all 4 of us with 4 camps? There were camps all over the place. Do you know how many men we had in our gun section? 17. How many did you have?
We had 23. It took 12 with the ramrod. But when we went firing around the clock, we did a square and a half. We had all of us, whatever shift you were on. Everybody was left in the crew to ram that shell in.
His artillery weapon came in 2 pieces, the tube and the carriage.
We had a crane that we put in.
Was that the Long Toms?
No, the 240.
That shell weighed 365 pounds.
But the Long Toms were 240s, weren't they?
The Long Toms were just like 155s. There was one outfit that was down behind us. Hell, they about blew our ears out.
I think they hung a misnomer on all those 240s. We always called them Long Toms.
You guys are sometimes our worst enemy.
We were very careful where we shot.
Sometimes we went too far or something, and next thing we caught our own shell fire.
Sometimes somebody would not hear the size of the powder charge. Some guy said a charge 3 or a charge 4 or charge 5. And somebody misinterpreted that and put the wrong charge in, and you got a short round. Terrible. Friendly fire.
We only had one of those. The shell we put the fuse screwed in on top, and I had an older fellow, we called him the old man. He was 40-some years old at the time. He was my gun mechanic. We took care of tubes anyway. We had a mission. They called us and said we were going to have a mission, and what kind of mission it was, and we were supposed to use a fuse at that time.
It was a proximity fuse.
Yeah, we fired the damn thing, but we didn't know if it was 7 miles or 15. If he'd stuck metal, that would have been it. New Year's Day in '45, we saw our first jet plane fly over us. We didn't know what it was. It made so damn much noise and so fast. He flew at treetop level. We always had anti-aircraft round us up pretty well. There was a P-38 chasing him, but he looked like he was flying backwards. I mean, he landed, they shot him down about 2 miles away from us.
The jet?
They shot him down.
I'm surprised the remains of that jet went back for analysis.
I'm surprised they were able to get it. They weren't familiar with that stuff yet.
I still say today, if Adolf had the ammunition and gas, we'd probably be fighting yet.
It'd be a little longer.
Oh God, yes.
But we'd have overpowered him with production.
Well, maybe so, but the Autobahn, you all saw that, how they had all the planes backed up on the side, just no fuel.
Down in Bavaria, dozens and dozens of them parked off in the woods. All they had to do was wheel them out on the Autobahn.
It looked like grass down the middle, but it was all cement. For miles and miles, they used them for runways.
Guys, did you ever get to see one of them famous big tanks, the Tiger?
Saw it in a museum, but never in combat.
I'll never forget this as long as I live. Our convoy came to a halt all of a sudden. They said they spotted 3 Tiger tanks coming our way, and everybody just froze, scared to death.
Oh, I know the feeling.
Then they said, all bazooka men up front. Well, me and 2 guys were the bazooka men. They said, spot them, but don't shoot at them. See what they do. If they turn around or stop, or if they aren't coming towards us, don't do anything. Well, my heart was right up here. We saw them in the clearing. They came to a stop. God, the tracks in them were this wide, monstrous things. I looked at my little bazooka and thought, what the hell chance do I have? I heard stories about how you're supposed to get them in the track or right in the turret. I was trying to figure this out. I knew how inept those goddamn bazookas were. Those damn things would go off all the time. This was close range by then, and all was quiet. All of a sudden, I heard a guy mumble something. I couldn't understand it. He sat there about 10 minutes, the longest 10 minutes I spent. Finally, they turned and went the other way. What a relief. That was quite an experience because we had heard about these things. We had heard there was hardly anything you could stop them with. Here we were supposed to stop them with our 3 little bazooka guns.
Yeah, in retrospect, very few Tigers.
That's right, they didn't have many.
They made a big hullabaloo about them, but there weren't many.
That was one hell of a tank.
You know, so many people poo-pooed the Shermans, but boy, the Shermans could get around.
They were very agile.
We rode on the back end of those tanks many a day.
I'm sure you did.
I did not.
I never did either. I had a truck one time that the captain loaned the signal company because they lost so many trucks to mines. We'd run out at night and have the canvas down on it and tank cable go right up over it and smash it all to hell. So I was out of a truck for a while till they found a new one. By the time I was with the Thunderbird Division right after the war, I was acting first sergeant when I got there, but I never got my stripes.
I have a very, very close and dear friend, a Jewish lad from World War II. We still correspond. He visited us last summer. He stayed at our house. After they got back to New York Cathedral High School, got a donation addressed to me at Cathedral.
You know, one of our best lieutenants was Lieutenant Cohen.
We had a Jewish lieutenant in one of our outfits, and he was a regular Joe.
Was that where you ended up? That's a concentration camp.
That's where I ended up. I stayed there, so I shouldn't say I stayed there. We left after a week. Then we had to stand guard on the Danube River. We were on one side, and the Russians were on the other. The Russian side had a nice road outside. There was a mountain. They wouldn't let us cross and come back.
I talked to a friend of mine who was a German Wehrmacht soldier. He spent 4 years in a Russian prison camp. Fortunately, he got out, and now he's an American citizen. He said, "Oh, well, we think things are tough."
Robert, I know that's hard to pronounce, but that's Wehrmacht.
Wehrmacht. Well, I have a Norwegian accent.
Those Russians. That was a hardy group. I had a bunch of watches, too, that I got from prisoners.
Isn't it kind of unusual that this many guys saw frontline action? I was under the impression that only 1 out of 10 guys got that close to the front.
Yeah, but where those other 40 guys are, we don't know. We never saw them.
There has to be a lot of other guys around New Ulm. You talked about Al Polta.
There are a lot of guys that never left the States.
What was it? There were, 10 guys working behind every guy on the front.
Well, God rest his soul, Wally Wilford. He never left the States.
That's why I say everybody, even if you have only 1 arm or leg, everybody should have at least 6 months in military training. You don't need a guy in A1 shape punching keys on a computer or a typewriter. A gal could do that, or somebody with 1 arm. We'd all been an even playing field. 100% military training would be good for all of us.
I have to tell you an anecdote. When we talked about the DP camps, some people who eventually ended up there, we were down in the Alps. The war's over. We moved from our initial spot to another pass. There were occupation troops there. Sunday came. And there was a fellow there named Joe Geary, and he was a sergeant. We decided we wanted to see where this little mountain stream came from, and we could look at our maps and could tell that it came from out of the mountains. So we were armed. We didn't happen to go up there without sidearms. And we got about 1 mile above the village, and I said, Joe, look over there. And there's a campfire there with a little smoke coming out of it and a pair of wires coming down into the trees where the field phones had been pulled right out. We got to a farmhouse, knocked on the door, smoke coming out of the chimney. Nobody would answer. So we walked up on the stream. We came to a glacier. It was a glacial melt is what it was. Monday morning about 9 in the morning, I get a frantic call from our captain. Doctor, I need an interpreter. Well, there were about a dozen Hitler youth. They had walked down out of the hills, and of course, they don't speak English, any of them. So I stumbled along with that kid who was leading them. Found out they'd been up there and had seen us the day before. They were being hidden by these farmers, but they didn't want them anymore because they couldn't feed them. And I said, where are you going now? Well, we decided we'd better walk home. Well, where's home? Well, some of them lived in Berlin, some lived here and there, hundreds of miles from nowhere. We kind of carefully made it clear that they were very, very hungry. So I asked the captain, do you suppose we got something we could feed these kids? They haven't eaten for quite a while. And the captain said, well, why should we? And I said, well, maybe we should start trying to make friends of these people instead of enemies. He said, go down and see the mess sergeant. And the cook said, we're not going to feed them. I asked him, do you have any batter left over from your pancakes that you were going to throw away? Yep. Well, as long as you're going to throw it away, why don't you just fry it up and feed it to him? No, all right, bring him down here. So I brought him down, and he managed to come up with something else, and they wiped out everything. Then we put them on trucks and took them up 50 miles north and put them into a DP camp. Now they start the process of getting back home. These kids were 12 years old. They'd been in a Hitler Jugend camp down there in the Alps. Some years ago, this lady friend of mine that formerly lived in New Ulm told me this terrible book she had read. I couldn't even buy it in the United States. I had to buy it in Canada. It's forbidden in the United States. I said, well, what's this all about? Well, it's how terrible you guys treated the German POWs in Europe. Oh, is that so? I'd like to see that book. So she sent it to me. This was the gall-darndest piece of propaganda I ever saw in my life. What they failed to realize was that when World War II ended, here we've got all these people that suddenly became POWs, hundreds of thousands of people, and no facilities to put them in. The buildings had been bombed out. A lot of military camps had been smashed to pieces. There were no decent places to put them. So for a few weeks, it was pretty touch and go to take care of these people until they got the military government organized to provide a system of supply just to get the basic things there like food. And some guy managed to work that out to be a sensational book. That's all that it was. Of course, people who didn't comprehend what was going on over there fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And then when these guys were here last week at this POW convention, they were taken out to the group camp here and they said, oh, those German POWs lived in a place this nice? We never had anything like that in Europe.
Because we treated them like human beings.
Yeah, we did.
That's how it should have been.
I think a lot of those had got mistreated in some of these camps over here too, though.
I'm sure they did.
Somebody was going to show those damned Americans that they could break their rules too, and they asked for it.
Around here, when they found out how easy the living was, they responded in kind. We're pretty easy to get along with.
The time was that the churches were not shot or bombed.
A sanctuary.
We had those snipers up in the church towers, and after that first thing, well, they got that. That was the church steeple that was shot after that.
If we did it, it was wrong, but if the Germans did it, well, then it was okay.
Otis Luce mentions the first time he flew a bomber into Germany, he had a tough time flying this mission until the anti-aircraft started coming up and started exploding around his B-24, then everything was forgotten.